good afternoon. They're responsive. Everybody must have had a good lunch and a little caffeine. Well, we're going to do something a little bit different for this session. And as Johnny and the Altar 84 folks were talking about putting this conference together, one of the thoughts was that a lot of times when you come to a conference like this, you get talked to a lot, but there's not a lot of dialogue. And it's sometimes a little difficult to get insight from the folks that are speaking during the plenary sessions. And so we kind of talked about the idea about setting up a panel discussion. And among the four of us, particularly because we all know each other and have relationships that kind of proceed, and thought it would be fun to take on a few issues and spend a little time together. So let me introduce these guys to you. Dr. Russel Moore, President of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. Tony Merida, that you guys have already met, pastor of Imago Dei Church and pastor at Southeastern Seminary. Of course, you guys know David Platt, who is the pastor here at the church at Brook Hills.
Who's he?
I don't know. Yeah. And so we're just going to spend a little time together. I'm going to throw out a few questions. Hopefully that'll spur a little bit of dialogue along. And then these guys are looking at me like I'm a talk show host or something, and I'm incredibly uncomfortable right now doing this. So anyway, I'm curious. They've heard a little bit of my story and a little bit of Tony's story, but Russ and David, you guys, I'd love for you to talk just a minute about what brought you to orphan care. What was kind of the sort of the crystallizing moment? What was the thing that was sort of the tipping point for you?
It all started with dinner at the Morton house for us. So we were in seminary in New Orleans, and not a lot of people know this part of the backstory, but we were in seminary in New Orleans, and Rick was on faculty there, and we had, Heather and I had wanted to have children, and the Lord not providing the way that we had planned, and so we start thinking, and I know that at that time I would have said, well, since we can't have children this way, I guess we'll do second best and we'll explore adoption. We learned obviously really quickly that adoption is just as best. And so we didn't know a lot of people who had adopted. And so we asked the Mortons if we could talk with, I was having a conversation with Rick one day. He said, you should come over to our house and you and Heather, and we'll just kind of share with you our story. They just walked through the adoption process. And so we went over there, and they showed us all these pictures, walked us through their whole story, their whole journey, and we went away, and my wife was in tears, like, I don't know if we can do all this, and but that kind of started us on a journey where a few months later we began the process of adopting our first son, and just to see that come in full circle, yesterday we celebrated Gotcha Day with him, so it was 7 years ago yesterday that he officially became our son. And then we had another son. We had tried for 5 years to have kids biologically. The Lord had led us on this path to Kazakhstan to adopt our first son. And then we got back, and 2 weeks later, Heather was pregnant. And so 9 months later, our second son, Joshua, came along. Then we knew we wanted to adopt again. And so we started that process I'll share a little bit more about this tonight, but in a roundabout way that led us to China. 3 years later, we adopted our little girl from China and then got back. And 3 months after that, Heather was pregnant again. So her doctor said, well, if you adopt 4, you'll have 8. And we said, no. So that's our story. But it all goes back to dinner at the Mortons.
And we have a very similar story because we have children who came into the family through adoption and children who came into the family through the more typical way. And also because our story started with years of infertility, and in our case, miscarriage as well. And my wife just happened to go to a conference, a seminar, probably very similar to this one Saturday morning when I was out of town. And when I came back, she said, I was really spending some time at this place, and I think maybe the Lord is leading us to adopt. And my response was reluctance at first. And because we didn't know people who had adopted before, really, we hadn't seen people walk through that before. And so my response was to say, I would love to adopt one day, but I'd rather that we have our own children first. That was the language that I used at the time, and that was the mentality that I had. And Maria just knew, if we're going to do this, if the Lord's leading us to do this, then he's leading him to lead. And so she stepped back, 1 Peter 3, she prayed, sought the Lord's work in my own life and in my own heart, and that happened. I remember just where I was on the road one day when suddenly I thought, yes, this is what we should do. And then we started the process not really knowing where we were going or what the outcome would be. But through that, I started to see how all the assumptions that I had that were leading to my reluctance were really misunderstandings about the gospel itself. And so that kind of reshaped a lot of things in our life.
That's great. One of the things that's kind of been a little bit of a theme during the time that we've already spent together is, as we've talked about adoption, is the messiness of it. And the fact that when we've talked about earthly adoption, that we're always dealing in brokenness. As pastors who are calling churches and leading the charge, and also pastors who you've led out with your own families. How do you find that working out in your ability to? Because we all acknowledge that there's unique pressure on our families as focal points, to sort of to be watched and to be kind of looked at as examples, but the messiness of working it out in your own home and the implications of adoption. Tony, you talked about that a little bit last night in your sermon and in your message, but practically living out the difficulty of adoption, while also representing the need for adoption as a part of orphan care.
It's a good question. I think we've tried to be very transparent and honest as we've talked about adoption. We try not to paint some romantic vision of adoption. We couch it in the terms of discipleship. And just like anything you do to follow Jesus, it's going to cost you, and our reward is not always coming in this life. We're looking for the life to come, and so I think what we've tried to do in our struggle is point people to the hope we have in the gospel, and not try to paint some picture that is unrealistic. But as I said last night, play gladiator music instead of soft music, and because it is a war. Orphan care is warfare. And by teaching this and saying this, I hope they're not surprised when they see that we have some conflict, because I'm not just saying this, like we really do have real struggles. I really do maybe often lose my temper and have to apologize. And I remember I was preparing a sermon once on the patience of God and lost my temper with my kids, and had to go and apologize to them. I'm trying to prepare a sermon on the patience of God. Would you leave me alone? And so I share this, to the congregation, and I'm a Christian first. I'm no different. My feet are, on this earth, and so we try to be transparent, but we try to, again, point people to gospel hope, and just tell them, that adoption really is a combination of beauty and brokenness, and all of Christian discipleship, I think, has that. There are incredible joys. So while painting the hardship, we also paint the beauty and the wonder and the glory of it. But it also is filled with, in this body we groan, in so many ways. So I don't know, just faithful teaching of the Bible, painting reality as best we can, and being transparent.
One of the things, I plan to address this a little bit later in my talk, but one of the things that I think is happening here is that that's not really unique to families who are adopting. It really is something that is true of parenting generally, but sometimes that can become more focused when it comes to adopting, because sometimes that focal point issue that you're talking about, underneath that is a great deal of pride and ego. I remember one time being in the middle of a store, and my boys were acting up. They were kind of in the floor wrestling and fighting with each other and causing a scene. And I'm over there looking around. I can see myself looking around because I'm thinking in the back of my mind, here they are. They're acting wild in the store. There are probably people in the store that God's led to adopt. They're looking here and they're looking at my kids and they're saying, this is what happens when you adopt. That's the adopted for life guy. He can't even control his own kids. So the whole global orphan crisis is on my shoulders right now. That is a really pitiful, messianic sense of what parenting is. But I think that's a temptation that every parent has, which is to see the children as something you need to get into order so that they make sense of your life, rather than seeing your life as being given over to parenting and rearing those children. And I think that's probably uniquely true when it comes to families who have adopted, families who have fostered, because we want to encourage other families. This isn't the sort of thing that you see where it's going to wind up with wild kids who are out of control and families that are desperate and upset. At the same time, we need to turn around and say, this means human relationship. This means a family, and family means that you're going to have discipline, you're going to have disobedience, you're going to have times of discouragement. That's what it means to love. That's what it means to be family.
Kind of maybe segueing from that just a little bit, what about the implications for the church? And what things have you seen? What things have you noticed? Transitions in life, work, community of the church as a result of the church stepping meaningfully into orphan care. David, maybe?
Yeah, I think I'm so thankful. When I came here almost 8 years ago, there was a real adoptive culture in this church, which is really is grassroots. When people are adopting, there's a built-in encouragement, and you're spurring one another on toward a James 1:27 kind of faith. And so that was really encouraging. I remember when we came here, I mentioned that we didn't know hardly anybody who adopted. We came here and we told people we were adopting, and the first question people would ask us was, how many? It's like, well, one? And then they'd look at us like we were underachievers. Oh, one. Well, yeah, they adopt by the tens around here. And so
We're waiting on radical adoption.
yeah, there you go. Yeah. So being here and then beginning to walk through texts like James. I mean, when we're talking about adoption, but obviously foster care is part of this picture too. When we were walking through James, and I just said to the people sitting in this room, hey, we've got tons of kids in our community who need care. I called up DHR, said, how many more families do you need to address all the needs you have? And they just laughed at me. I said, well, no, how many? And they said, we could use 150 more families. And I said, all right. And so I just called the church to say, we need to step up and do foster care in our community, in our county. And we had a meeting in this room, I'll never forget it, on a Sunday afternoon, and people just start streaming in. And this lady from DHR is in the back, and she's just wide-eyed watching this. And that night, about over 150 of our families signed up to help with foster care. And this woman comes up to me, just tears streaming down her eyes from DHR, and she says, what made you decide to do this, Pastor? And I said, I didn't decide to do this. The Lord decided these kids were important to him. And so I realized in that moment that the church is uniquely qualified to care for the orphan, because there are families that can adopt, there are families that can do foster care, there are families that can support families who are adopting and doing foster care, and there's a community built in. When you walk through our children's ministry wing over here on a Sunday, and you see kids from all over the city and all over the world in these, and an entire faith family gathered around caring for these kids and supporting the families that are walking through the ups and downs of adoption. I can imagine walking through adoption, foster care without the church as a surrounding community in that. And so I'm just convinced that God has uniquely formed his people to care for for the fatherless.
When we look at the mass of orphans and vulnerable children in the world, we have to acknowledge that most of them are not adoptable to us. They live in conditions and places where they're not adoptable to us, or they're in statuses where they're not adoptable to us, street children or in other family situations. What are some things that you guys have seen, maybe ways that churches are responding effectively to caring for orphans globally, or ways that that maybe something unique that you've encountered that you would say that's a way that we respond with the gospel, that we respond to the nations?
I want to throw out just one thing real quick, based on what I was just sharing, because I think my mind immediately, maybe our minds immediately start to go toward orphan care, it's just specific orphan care. But I just want to point out the obvious, too, that church planning is huge toward this end. And so when you think about taking the gospel to unreached peoples, planting churches in North America, planting churches among the nations where there are no churches, the church is uniquely designed and qualified, which we were just talking about, for orphan care. And so the best way to care for orphans is by preaching the gospel and planting churches, and then helping those churches to think through how to do the orphan care. And so just not to disconnect the church and automatically try to think of other social avenues outside the church, which we're wise to think through those as well. But if we do that first and we bypass, no, church planning is actually going to be huge for the care of orphans, then we may be bypassing the most important route to address this issue. So I just want to make sure that's on the table.
I was going to just add to that. So anytime we're training leaders indigenously, that is the local nationals, I think we need to be talking about this, because it's just not it's not in their mind. So when I teach church planning in Kyiv every year, and they have orphanology in Russian, and that's a textbook for church planning, just because these are going to be the guys who are going to be influencing. So any way we can support in-country adoptions we need to be thinking about that. So I know Life Song for Orphans, effectively emptied an orphanage last year by 150 Christian Ukrainian families that adopted children. It costs like $500 compared to $26,000 for an American. You can give to in-country adoptions through that particular group and probably some others. But these countries have they have terrible teaching. Like, many think orphans are cursed, so you won't bring an orphan into your house. And that's in Africa, that's other parts of the world. So we really need to educate. Education is huge in some of these places.
And I think we need to keep in mind, no one church can do everything. And so a church that simply looks at the global nature of the crisis can easily become discouraged to say, what in the world can we do? But what happens in Jesus' story of the Samaritan, how does he know to care for the person who's been beaten and left by the side of the road? He passes by him. He sees him. And so you need to pay attention to the way the Spirit is working in your congregation where there is some connection. Sometimes there will be families in a church who have adopted from a particular place, maybe a particular neighborhood, maybe a particular country. They have a special burden for that place. Or maybe within your congregation you have people who have adopted or they fostered children who are in a particular sort of need. So the Lord has laid on their hearts a burden for kids with AIDS, or for kids who are born to drug-addicted moms, or whatever the situation is, and they have a special leading and burden for those people. We'll say, what is the Spirit saying to us in that, and how can we then work in that? Because ultimately what we're wanting to do is not simply to see more children adopted, although we want every child who needs a family to have a family. We're also wanting to work to see to it that there are future adoptions that don't have to happen, where intact families stay together, where people aren't being driven apart by substance abuse or by poverty or by war or by whatever is going on. And so we work within our congregation to say, how is the Lord uniquely gifting our congregation, and what sort of burden is God giving to the people in our congregation, and how do we awaken that conscience and put action to it?
Along those lines, just and this pertains especially to foster care, but we know the goal of foster care is to help reunite children with their parents biologically, if that's possible. And I've seen that it's sometimes easier to have just compassion, broken heart over this child than it is over this mom or dad who's on this or that drug and addicted to this or that. And whereas we're directing compassion toward child, if we're not careful, we can direct anger toward this mom or dad. And so to make sure to guard against that and to say, how can we direct compassion toward both? And there are some circumstances where that reunion doesn't happen, and so then adoption comes about. But that's not the only goal here. The goal is care for the fatherless, and oftentimes that means caring for mom or dad in this situation, just to make sure to keep the focus there.
Another need internationally is transitional assistance. We need to in some way figure out how to help these kids once they age out of orphanages, because in so many parts of the world they have nothing. I mean, literally nothing. Nowhere to go. No relationships. No training. So if we could turn our businessmen loose on the problem worldwide, help them connect with orphanage directors. If churches could perhaps adopt orphanages, build relationships with the kids to the degree that they know where they're going once they age out. We just really need to do all that we can for these transitional, as we do in America as well. I mean, it's the same. We need to do that here too.
And that is absolutely pivotal, because there are places in the world where children have been in orphanages all of their lives. They've had virtually no human contact in preparation for the outside world. And then suddenly they age out at 17, 18, and they're just sent out into communities where all that is left for them is a life of substance abuse, prostitution, often suicide. And so we need people who are able to minister to those people who are orphans just as much as the infant who is able to be adopted into a family, but who can't be adopted, but they can be ministered to.
I know I'm supposed to be moderating the panel, but I'll just add to that's a local church issue in those places, and it's a discipleship issue, that we have to begin to walk with those kids long before they age out, and have to begin to be prepared to assimilate them into the local church, and to begin to walk with them after they age out. So just a couple of you guys hit on, as we were talking about that, and we were kind of talking more in a global context, but it kind of, I think, leads to a question maybe if we pull a little bit closer to home. One of the things that maybe I think we've struggled with in this issue, and maybe even some other things, with justice issues in general, is sort of maybe it's been talked about, maybe the doing and the telling of the gospel, or the evangelism and social justice, or the idea that maybe in our conservative evangelical circles that we ran so hard away from the social gospel that we left behind justice issues at some point. How do we meaningfully recapture that ground with churches that have so struggled, and how do we protect ourselves from giving way to what some folks would call the slippery slope, I guess, again?
We teach the Bible. And I think that the problem with that is whenever I hear people saying, well, we shouldn't address justice issues because we need to be concentrating on the gospel, I'll notice that these people don't do that when it comes to personal ethics. So, for instance, no one says, we're not going to address sexual immorality because we simply need to preach the gospel. Preaching the gospel means that one has to address sexual morality, because on the one hand, one has to say, this is what you must repent of, and on the other hand, this is what it means to follow Christ. So if someone says to me, is sexual morality necessary to be saved? I'm going to say, what are you talking about? If the person says, I need to make sure that I'm sexually pure so that I'm good enough for Jesus and then I can be saved, I'm going to say, no, that's a false gospel. That's not what the gospel is. But if someone comes and says, yeah, I'm saved, I know Jesus, that means I can be as sexually immoral as I want to be. I'm going to say, no, that's a false gospel. That's not what it means to follow Christ. Jesus is Lord. The same thing applies to every area of obedience. That's why Jesus is constantly saying, the apostles are constantly saying, John says, if you say, I love the brothers, and yet you say, and James says the same thing, you say, be warmed and filled, you're not following Christ. So all we're doing is saying, this is what the gospel is, and then this is what it means to follow Christ and to be obedient to his word.
Amen. And
Yes.
to quote Russ Moore, he once said, a great theologian, happens to be a friend, the same instinct that compels me to care for those in need and to do justice is the same instinct that should cause me to tell the gospel, and it is love. And I think what we need deeply in our hearts is love, and we often set up this false choice for people as if these two are at odds, when it really is about loving our neighbor, which does include, caring for the AIDS patient, while we give them the hope that they have in Jesus, giving water to people while we tell them about Jesus, who will satisfy their every need. The question is really not so much how these two fit together, but do I love people? And if I do love a person, then I'm going to act both with words and actions. And so the real issue is my heart, not so much whether or not this is some mystery that we can tie together. So I just want to put that forward as something we should be longing for, and to really see the kingdom of God as something that is already and not yet. And so when we're doing works of justice and mercy, we're basically bringing the future into the present, and we have an opportunity to show the world what the King is like, what the kingdom is going to be like, and in that we proclaim the kingdom in both word and deed. So I find that a lot of people who make this argument aren't doing evangelism. I find it's often a smokescreen, for not wanting to do much of anything. And the other thing I've found is that I get to do more evangelism because I do social ministry than I did without ever trying to do social ministry. I inevitably get into conversations about the gospel when I'm talking to people about justice or trying to serve orphans. So again, I think this is a false choice that people have put out there. And if we avoid stuff because there's an abuse to it, we wouldn't do anything. Everything can be abused. So it's not just this slippery slope to liberalism. We could make that argument about everything.
Including evangelism.
Yeah.
Because there are people who have been manipulative in the way they've done evangelism. Then let's not preach the gospel. We don't want to wind up being a television evangelist. No, you preach the gospel faithfully. Do it right.
Tony mentioned, just quoting Russell Moore, Russell has been just hugely helpful to me on this in ways that I could just go into that very few people know about. But I think, when I think about this, I hear people sometimes saying, Dave, you need to be cautious when you start talking about social justice or social ministry. And I think the exact opposite. We don't need to be cautious about what God has said he's passionate about, which is the care of the orphan and the help to the oppressed. We don't need to be cautious about that. At the same time, we do need to be zealous about evangelism, about biblical, faithful evangelism, and to acknowledge in every one of our lives, I see it in my own life, I see it in this church, if we're not careful, we will get consumed in doing social ministry and not be proclaiming the gospel, and that's not good. That's not all that we've been called to do. And so I would just encourage us, even as we're talking about this and saying, yes, we got to do social ministry, make sure that we are zealous about evangelism, that we're zealous about leading people to Christ, that we are caring about all suffering, especially eternal suffering, and that we're addressing eternal suffering with our lives while we're addressing earthly suffering with our lives.
And also, I think, as we're preaching the gospel, we're keeping in view judgment. We're calling people to accountability before the judgment seat, and we're reminding ourselves that we will give an account at the judgment seat, which means what? It means Matthew 25. And one of the things that happened to me several years ago, I heard someone saying something, and it struck me. I've never forgotten it. Because I was talking about social ministry as a means to evangelism. I'd been talking about that, for years and years and years. And this person stood up and said, we have in our community a group of severely mentally retarded toddlers who are not aware that anyone is around. He said, our church goes in and holds these toddlers and brushes their hair we're not able to speak the gospel to them, is that a waste of time? And I had to say, no, of course that's not a waste of time. Why? Because this is a group of people who they are seeing the face of Jesus in the face of the neighbor who is in distress. And what should that do? That should motivate those people as they are loving these children to love others who are in danger of hell. And so it ought to motivate us and fuel us to love neighbor as self, which means, as Carl Henry put it years and years ago, how do you love yourself biblically? You love yourself by feeding yourself, clothing yourself, washing yourself, but that's not all. You love yourself by preaching the gospel and receiving spiritually what it means to be reconciled to God. So you see people as whole people who need the whole gospel all of the time, and know that the devil always wants to come in and to divert us from the mission of Christ in either direction or in any direction. And so if the devil can just get you to either compartmentalize people down to simply spiritual units and say, be warmed and filled, but here's a gospel tract. Or if the devil can turn you into someone who's willing to clothe people and feed people, but not willing to save them from hellfire, he is accomplishing something. So we just need to be constantly watching that and following Christ, which means living the way that he lived, which was a really complicated sort of presence with people.
There are a number of criticisms that have been leveled at the movement of Christian adoption and orphan care. Many of them by people from outside the church, from outside the movement, that have been sort of lobbed at the movement. Things like that. The reason that we in the church are doing adoption, that we do transracial adoptions in order to make up for a racist past. That we are exacerbating the orphan crisis and we're making things worse. We create a demand for orphans. Those kinds of things. I mean, how would you guys respond to maybe those two things?
Well, first of all, the very same people who are saying that it's a subversive thing that evangelical Christians are adopting are the very people who, if evangelical Christians were not adopting, would be saying, look at how awful these hypocrites are because they believe in the right to life for fetuses, but they won't adopt them once they're born. So there's no way that you're going to please that particular audience, no matter what it is that we do. That said, the criticisms come at a variety of levels. Some of those things are right. Are there some evangelical Christians who are too naive about what it means to adopt or to foster? Yes, and that's why everybody up here has been spending our lives not only saying to some people, here's why God is calling you to adopt or to foster, but saying to an entirely other group of people, God is not calling you to foster and to adopt. The criticism that there are abuses and there's trafficking involved sometimes, that's exactly right. And that's why the very same people, part of the church, who are working in finding families for children who need families are also working to prevent trafficking. And then the criticism often comes, well, what you're trying to do is to adopt children in order to evangelize them. I hear this one a lot. And the response is to say, families always teach their children the things that those families believe. A secular, progressive family is going to teach children secular, progressive values. A Buddhist family is going to teach Buddhism. And an evangelical Christian family is going to teach the gospel, naturally. But we're no more adopting or fostering in order to share the gospel than we're marrying and having children in order to share the gospel. We're marrying and having children because we love one another and we love children, and part of that means that we share the gospel. And I've said to some of those critics, I believe in sharing the gospel, but there are much easier ways to do it than to go through home study, all of these things in order to do that. But I don't think we're going to be able to. We simply need to recognize that we need to pay attention to criticisms and say, where are things that are legitimate? Let's do those things better. But there is going to be a certain sector of, especially the American public, that whatever is happening under the name of Jesus Christ is going to be subject to criticism. We need just to be ready for that.
Whenever I receive criticism, I just pull up something that Russell Moore has said and say, this is what I think to that. So that's what I would say to any of those criticisms.
Do you receive criticism?
Just once, and I pointed him to Russell.
Yeah. I do think we need to act in wisdom, and so I appreciate some of the critique, as Dr. Moore said. I think about the prayer in Philippians 1. Paul's praying for the church in Philippi that they would grow in love with discernment. And there, of course, he's speaking about among the congregation, but I like that concept. We need a loving discernment. We need to figure out what's the best way to love with wisdom. And so that's what we should be asking, I think, with orphan care ministry is let's not do anything foolish. Let's not be cavalier. Let's use wisdom. Let's use the best agencies. Let's ask all the hard questions. Let's do our homework. So let's love with discernment.
There was one issue today that 2 or 3 times today in the hallways and around that folks brought up and mentioned, and this is a difficult thing. But in the current debate and in the current climate in our country with the whole same-sex marriage debate, the issue of adoptions among same-sex couples is at the forefront of this movement. And many agencies, many Christian agencies are having to deal with what they do and how they respond in fostering and in responding to the adoption of children. What counsel would you give as to how to proceed and what's the proper way for people to respond to the issue?
Well, I am not in favor of working to make same-sex couples adopting illegal. I don't think that's what the Lord would call us to do. I think what the Lord would call us to do is to speak to our own community and say we need Bible-believing evangelical Christians who understand James 1:27 to be out adopting and fostering and caring for orphans, regardless of what the rest of the world is doing right now. That said, I think that we need to be maintaining the freedom and liberty for evangelical and Roman Catholic and other adoption agencies to be able to place children in what they believe to be, what we believe to be the best environment for children to grow up in, which is a home with both a mom and a dad. And that's increasingly problematic. Catholic Diocese of Massachusetts right now finding it impossible to even do adoption services not because they're trying to say no one else can adopt, but because they're saying we wish to place children in homes with both a mom and a dad. They're now finding themselves being driven out of licensure. I think we need to be the sort of people who are doing what the Apostle Paul was doing in the book of Acts, coming in, appealing to Roman citizenship. He is moving his way through because he wants to see the freedom of the church maintained as much as possible. We need to be doing that, including in this area of orphan care and adoption. That doesn't mean that we're saying to gay and lesbian people on the outside of the church, well, you're evil and wrong because you want to adopt children. No, we don't second guess other people's motives, and there are often very good motives that are there. But we say because we're Christians who believe the Bible, we believe that what's best for children isn't just parenting, it's mothering and fathering. And those are two different things, and they're complementary things, and so we need to maintain the freedom to be able to do that.
Whenever I get a tough question like that, I pull up something Russell Moore has said.
Please direct all same-sex questions to Russ.
But you know, the most controversial thing when it comes to this point that I've found isn't the same-sex couples issue, it's the single parent adoption issue. Frankly, the most angry I think anyone has ever been at me, and that is saying something, was over that issue because there was a single mom. She stood up in a context in a church and she said, should I adopt a child? What do you think? And I said, you know, this isn't thus saith the Lord, this is thus thinketh more, two totally different things. I said, but I said, I think that the best situation for a child is to have both a mom and a dad. There are some situations where providentially somebody's died, somebody's left. That doesn't happen, and then we do the best we can. And a lot of heroic single moms out there and single dads working in that situation. I said, but I think it's best not to start a family without both a mom or a dad. So I would say if God's calling you to adopt, then he's probably calling you to be married, and so you need to pray for that whole situation, or to say, how can I care for orphans in other ways that are there? So I think that's a situation that right now is probably more relevant to our churches, at least immediately. And I think what we need to say to that is to make very clear, regardless of where we come down on that particular question, to be sure that every time we talk about James 1:27, that we're making clear that doesn't mean that every person can only carry out James 1:27 by adopting or being disobedient to James 1:27. There are a variety of ways that the body of Christ, diversity of gifts, come together in caring for orphans and caring for mothers and widows in their distress.
David, you ever said anything that made anybody mad in a conference? No?
Once, but I just wanted to Russell more.
So if you were to look 5 years in the future at where the church is and the Christian adoption and orphan care movement, what the church is doing, do you have a hope? Is there something that you would like to see us? Is there something you'd like to see us doing? Is there something that you'd like to see us not doing? Is there something that you would like to see your church doing? Is there something that some kind of grand thing?
When I think about that, two thoughts immediately come to my mind that I would pray for in churches across our landscape. One, more local ownership. So the Luke 10, who do you see? What is the Spirit doing in your community? What are the needs in your community? What has God uniquely called, wired, equipped your church to do? Local ownership of care for. This is it. It will display the beauty of the gospel. It will draw us all closer to Christ. It will care for orphans, for the fatherless and families. So more local ownership and then more global partnership. So to intentionally work alongside other churches in the world to help think through education, opening eyes. This is something I've been trying to be more intentional of. When I was in, you mentioned Korea. I was preaching Korea last fall, and just shared our story of adoption, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, we don't really adopt here. And they began explaining Korean bloodline and the importance of this or that. And so I just sensed this was the Lord saying, this is an opportunity to speak into something that needs to change in this particular church. And so I just, I took a whole sermon and I said, there's a bloodline that's more important than Korean bloodline, and it goes through a cross, and it compels us to care for those who are beyond our physical bloodline. And it was so wonderful to see this church. They began, by the end of this conference that I was preaching at, they had people outside at booths helping couples think through how to care for orphans in their community. And so to be sensitive to opportunities we have to cultivate partnership with churches in other areas, helping them, not just saying, how can we take orphans and adopt them, which is obviously a good thing. At the same time, how can we help you care for orphans in your midst? How can we help cultivate that kind of local ownership in this or that area? I'm so encouraged by many of the adoption agencies and things that are happening along those lines. So I would just hope that just an increased local ownership in our churches and an increased global partnership between churches.
And I would just say, I'm very hopeful about the Christian orphan care movement. I don't have any worries about that. What I do wish is that the situation were flipped. I think there are many ways in which churches are seeing what it means for families to be united across their differences by adoption, when those families should have been learning that from the church itself. And so it really shouldn't be a situation where I am, and David is, and Tony is at the beginning of our adoption journeys, starting to wonder kind of intuitively, could I love a child who's not biologically from me? We should have already been seeing that all of our lives in the makeup of churches that are brought together not by common interests and not by common demographics, but by the blood of Christ and by the Spirit of Christ. And so I think the best thing that we can do for orphans around the world is to make sure that the spirit of adoption is creating churches, not the spirit of demographic targeting and marketing. And so the Christian orphan care movement will be doing very well when we have churches that aren't defined as white churches and black churches and blue-collar churches and white-collar churches, but instead churches that are made up of people who resemble the kingdom of God and who may not have anything else in common except that we believe the same gospel. And they're learning what it means to be a family because they're around the same Lord's table together, and they don't have the same skin color, and they don't have the same income background, and they don't have the same family story going back. Then we're able to see, oh, well, yes, of course we can be a family without that bloodline because we already are. I think that's the best thing that we could see happen.
I think that's a great note for us to close on. We're going to pray together.